Morning, morning, morning. Good morning. Good morning to you.
We turn our attention now to our conversations on CARICOM. As always, with Barbados Ambassador to CARICOM, His Excellency David Comissiong. Ambassador, good morning.
Morning, Pearson. Pleasure.
I said this to him when I sat on the set with him this morning. When do you sleep? You are so busy.
Well, it's a sense of mission, you know. But just, you know, there's so many things, Pearson, that come together, and Barbados is in the center of them all. I mean, you can't talk about the transatlantic slave trade and the United Nations having a day today to celebrate, commemorate its abolition, and not think of Barbados, because, as you said, 1627, you know, at the very commencement of the settlement of Barbados, they brought 10 enslaved Africans. Yes. So we became the world's first out-and-out slave society. So Barbados was a hub of that transatlantic slave trade. Not only did, you know, hundreds of thousands actually come to Barbados of our African ancestors and remain here, but Barbados was a transshipment point. So, you know, so we are central to that whole story. And we are going to be here this morning talking about the launch in Trinidad and Tobago of the United Nations' second International Decade for People of African Descent, under the theme of People of African Descent, Recognition, Justice, and Development. So I went to Trinidad and Tobago to participate in that ceremony on Friday. And then I come back to Barbados Saturday, and yesterday we have the launch in the groundbreaking ceremony and the ceremony of the handing over of the land at Jamet Lane for the African Export and Import Bank's African Trade Center and headquarters. And if you wanted a perfect example of development, of recognition of people of African descent coming together under that United Nations theme, you could not have asked for a better one than what happened in Barbados yesterday.
So the first decade was impactful. The second decade we expect to be even more impactful, particularly because we're seeing movement in talking about the development. So recognize, I want to say apologize, and now development essentially. So what does this mean, you think, for the development of the African people in the Caribbean, this establishment of the Afreximbank Trade Center?
Well, first of all, let me make the point that the very fact that we have a United Nations decade for people of African descent, in fact, a second decade, Barbados and the CARICOM countries played a very significant role in that, because all of these developments have their roots in the United Nations World Conference Against Racism that was held in Durban, South Africa in 2001. Right. And we, Barbados, CARICOM, we played a big role in that World Conference, but particularly pushing issues. It was a World Conference Against Racism, so it related to all races, all ethnicities, but we paid a special attention to Africans and people of African descent. And so all of these subsequent developments can be traced back to that contribution. Yes, we had the first decade, 2015, to the end of December of last year. Some things were accomplished, but the truth be told, we were not satisfied. We were not satisfied that United Nations had done enough, you know, to help propel the activities of the decade. And some of us were not satisfied that governments, even African and Caribbean governments, had sufficiently gotten on board and really pushed it. So, you know, I was looking back in 2015, we had come together in Barbados. We formed a national coordinating committee. We came up with a national agenda for Barbados. it faltered along the way. But when I look back at the document, I mean, some of the things we were demanding in 2015 is that Barbados become a republic. We get rid of the Nelson statue, that we do a slavery memorial at the Newton burial ground, that we reinstate free university education, that we do black studies, African studies in the school curriculum, etc. And when you look back, you said, well, you know, a number of these things did happen. But anyhow, but the feeling was that enough wasn't accomplished, and so we demanded a second decade. Now, what is going to make this second decade even more promising is that we now have at the United Nations a new entity named the United Nations Permanent Forum on People of African Descent. It's a 10-person international forum. 2 of the persons on that forum are CARICOM people. In fact, the current chair of the forum is Dr. June Suma of St. Lucia. So we expect that what the first decade lacked was that it did not have that specialized agency within the UN system to really keep attention focused on the decade. We now have that. And so a big part of the message on Friday in Trinidad was to say, this was in Trinidad we had a national launch. So this is their Trinidad national launch. And we are advocating that every CARICOM country also have a national launch. And in fact, right across global Africa that we have national launches. But the message that came up on Friday was we have to make full use of this decade because, you know, this is really a critical time for people of African descent.
Yes, it
a
is.
lot of the gains that we thought we had achieved, we can actually see attempts now being made to roll them back. So it's almost like a godsend at a time when we see facing us so many challenges to our welfare as people of African descent. This decade comes along. So we said, look, we have to make full use of this next 10 years. Our governments have to be on board. UE, our universities have to be on board. UN, and so we had Dr. Suma there representing the UN Permanent Forum. We had the principal of the St. Augustine campus of UE, Professor Antoine. We had the chair of Trinidad and Tobago's National Reparations Commission, Dr. Claudius Fergus. Of course, I was there. We had the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Trinidad and Tobago, represented by their Permanent Secretary, Miss Rita Toussaint. So we had a beautiful coming together of government, civil society, university. And out of that, we want this determination to go forward, that we will all work together and we will make the best of this decade, right? And that brings us to what happened yesterday in Barbados. Because we could not want a better example of what we as people of African descent, and people of African descent are continental Africans as well, huh? We are all people of African descent. Yesterday, when we put in motion, and I want to share with you, Pearson, I didn't see you there, so I need to bring your program.
Thank you very
from
much.
the groundbreaking ceremony yesterday. And on page 5 of this program, you'll see an image of what is going to materialize at that Jammett's Lane location. It's the Afreximbank African Trade Center. So it is a facility, $360 million facility. It's going to be the headquarters of the Caribbean headquarters of Afreximbank. It is going to be a hotel. It is going to be a small and medium enterprise incubation center, a technology incubation center, exhibition facilities, conference facilities. It's going to be a digital trade center. So it's going to provide a whole range of of services for Barbadian and Caribbean people. And it is historic because, you know, as Professor Orama,
Yes.
the president of Afreximbank, has been saying, look, you know, this Middle Passage that we experienced during those centuries of that transatlantic slave trade, whose abolition we are commemorating today, it separated us. It separated African people in the Caribbean from our brothers and sisters in the continent, and Barbados became a victim of that Middle Passage. We want to reverse that Middle Passage now. Everything that was negative about it, we want to make positive. And we want to come together as an African people to build up each other, you know? And so Barbados could not have sent a more positive signal about how we use this second International Decade for People of African Descent than what we did yesterday.
In discussion with other foreign ministers and other dignitaries like yourself, what do you see to be some of the other primary agenda items that the forum should advocate at the United Nations?
Well, the fundamental item is going to be reparations.
Right.
And reparations in its evolved format. You know, when we began the first decade in 2015, we probably had a fairly simple concept of reparations, you know. Injustices were done to us and something was owed to us. But over the decade, as we have pursued reparations, it has evolved. And we have come to recognize that it is not just about compensation for past historical wrongs and injustices, but in fact, it is about reforming the entire international order that we existing today. It's not just about the past. It's very much about the present, and it's about creating a more just and supportive international order for Africans, for African countries, for Caribbean countries. It is also about looking within, Pearson. It's about part of the UN decade when they say recognition. Part of the recognition is to acknowledge the good and wholesome things about Africa's heritage, our culture, our arts. So it is about us, you know, looking within. We talk about self-repair, appreciating ourselves as African people, addressing any lingering notions that might exist of white superiority and black inferiority and all of that. So if you wanted one all-embracing concept to kind of symbolize what this decade needs to produce, we can bring it down to that concept of reparations. Just repairing, compensation, acknowledging wrongs, trying to create a new, trying to take these relationships that historically have been mired in injustice and oppression and victimization, and atone for that and take them to a higher level of mutual respect and human solidarity and so forth. So that, in a nutshell, would be at the core of what this decade hopes to achieve. But you know, it is really multifaceted. So under recognition, there are a whole host of things, looking at culture and heritage and history. It's all about creating a world in which black people, African people, enjoy their full economic, social, civil, political rights. And sometimes we in Barbados, we might struggle with this because, you know, we are a predominantly black country, predominantly black government. We don't, some of the abuses that other black people suffer, we don't suffer. But we need to be conscious that our reality is not the universal reality. In many countries, you have black people who are racial minorities, still very much oppressed, still suffering from racial profiling in how the police operate, still being denied access to education, to healthcare, etc. So the decade is a call to collective action where we come together, we become more conscious of ourselves as an African collective, and we really work together. But yes, but while we ask the UN and all these agencies to help us, fundamentally, we also have to do for self. And that's
right.
where that partnership, where we come together, symbolizes that doing for self, you know? Yeah.
You know, Ambassador, this is obviously the springboard for a lot of other conversations on CARICOM, and certainly we'll be happy to invite you back again next week, God Spare Life, to continue looking at, again, how this establishment of the Afreximbank in Barbados, the second international decade on people of African descent, how all of these intersect so well about how we live and how we practice as a people. And so I want to thank you again for inspiring us in this conversation.
Morning, morning.